We have our candle and I am lighting it up. We have our warm cup of coffee. So that could only mean that we are talking about some books. Hello friends, welcome back to another video. Thank you so much for being here. If you are new here, hello, welcome. My name is Kim, and here on my channel I love to talk about books. I like to share cozy and intentional videos about lifestyle and writing and all the feel-good in between things. Today I bring you a very chatty video about some of my favorite book reads of 2023. Now 2023 was a year for me that I really got invested into reading. It is the year that I started my booktube channel. I have been getting back into reading the last few years, but I didn't really take it very seriously until 2023, and that's when I made my booktube newbie tag, and then that's when I started sharing more book related content. I forgot to mention that I am an author illustrator, so before making more videos about books I used to share a lot of like art studio vlogs and just vlogs about my art, but then I started shifting it a little bit because reading and books has always been like a big passion of mine ever since I was young, but I unfortunately lost that connection because adulting, and then I started reconnecting to reading a few years back and then really took it seriously this year. So with that being said, I started really getting into books and really trying to find my genre and what felt good for me and what kind of books were like my books, the kind of books that I really enjoyed. I started figuring out my reading routines and just trying to form a relationship with reading and with books. So it was a lot of just trial, no errors, because I do not believe in errors. So it was a lot of trial and just getting to know books. And so I read some books this year. So these are some of my physical books that I loved in 2023, and then I'm gonna pop some audiobooks that I listened to that I really loved in 2023. So if all that sounds good to you friends, grab something warm and cozy to drink, bring some snacks, and let's chat about some books. If you like these kind of videos, please remember to engage with this video, like, subscribe, comment. Everything helps with the YouTube algorithm so my videos can get pushed to the audience that loves these kind of videos. So that support from you would really help my channel out and I would be extremely grateful. So I'm gonna try and go in order from what I remember reading in the very beginning of the year all the way till now. And by the way, these are all going to be like 5 4-star books that stayed in my heart and that I still remember them till today. So that's how I determined when a book was really significant, like when they made a really big impression on me is when I'm still thinking about the story till today, and they have become some of my favorite books. So the first one that I remember reading is Shunas Journey by Hayao Miyazaki. And if you're not familiar with who Hayao Miyazaki is, and I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but if you're not familiar with Hayao Miyazaki, he is a filmmaker and a director, and he is the co-founder of the Studio Ghibli films. And this is, by the way, a graphic book, which is so pretty to look at. It's everything. Like I want to live in these color palettes and in this story. Oh, and by the way, I'm not going to go too much in depth about what the book was about. I'm going to do like a quick brush up because I have about, I don't know, like maybe like 13 books here that I want to tell you guys all about. But this story follows Shuna, who is a prince of a land, and Shuna is devastated because he's watching his people work themselves to death. In his land, there's a grain that grows and they harvest it, but unfortunately lately grain hasn't really been growing, and so his people have been having a hard time harvesting the grain and having money. And then one day this traveler comes by Shuna's land and presents him with this magical grain that is like supposed to just grow if you like plant it, I believe. So he tells Shuna where he can go find this magical piece of grain. So Shuna sets off to try and go find it in hopes that he can restore his land and hopefully give his people something to look forward to and not be struggling so much. So the story is about Shuna setting off on this journey to go and find this magical piece of grain, and then along the journey he meets this girl who she and her sister are in trouble, and so Shuna also decides to help them. It's a very cozy read. I really loved the graphics in here, and I absolutely love Studio Ghibli films. So if you love Studio Ghibli and you just want it in a book format, then I highly recommend Shunas Journey. All right, so this next book really got me introduced to, I suppose, cozy fantasy books. This one and then the following one really got me introduced to cozy fantasy books. And this is when I started seeing like okay, these kind of books are the ones that I'm really feeling, that are really up my alley, and that is In the Company of Witches by Auralee Wallace. This is based in the New England area. Of course, if we're talking about coziness, it's gonna usually be set in the New England area, and this is based in a bed and breakfast, which of course we love. I know I do. So this story follows the Warren witches, and in particular we're following our main character whose name is Bryn, and Bryn helps her aunts run the bed and breakfast, and then one day someone who was staying at the bed and breakfast ends up dead, and at first they just think that the person just died because they died, but then they end up investigating that it might have been intentional. And it just so happens that one of Bryn's aunts, Nora, is getting blamed for the death of this particular person who passed away in the bed and breakfast, and so Bryn of course sets off on her own to try and put justice to her aunt's name, all while Bryn is also battling her own grief that she's going through because something happened in her own personal life, and so that caused her to sort of suppress her own magical abilities. So this was very cozy. I absolutely love a murder mystery, and the setting is based in autumn, and it just gave me all the good feels, even though it is a murder mystery. But honestly, if it's based in the fall, if it has witches and a bed and breakfast, it's already something that's going to be like a 5-star most likely for me. Again, like I mentioned, this next read got me introduced to cozy fantasy, and I am so grateful for this book because it was just so good, and that's gonna be Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. I've never had so much fun with a book like how I had with Legends and Lattes. This is a no stakes fantasy book, and what that means, at least what it meant for me, is that it is not usually driven too much by plot. It is something easy that you can just follow along. There's not gonna be super drastic twists and turns going on. It is something easily consumable, and honestly, I absolutely love books like this. So this follows an orc named Viv, and Viv has been a lifelong warrior, and Viv decides to put down her sword finally and open up a coffee shop. And so where she decides to settle down, nobody has heard of coffee. So this is just the story of Viv trying to set up her little coffee shop and trying to get the local townsfolk introduced to what coffee is. There's so much cozy talk about coffee and pastries. There is like a small little problem that she has to get through in this story, but nothing that is too frantic or requires too much like paying attention, I feel. She ends up getting like a little partner to help her run her coffee shop. They make a little cozy menu together. There is a little love story that goes down. It was just so cozy. So if you're looking something that is cozy and has beautiful descriptions about pastries and coffee, something that you could just have a good old fun time with, then I highly recommend for you to read Legends and Lattes. There is a prequel to this that just came out. I believe it's called Bookshelves and Bone Dust, which I have, and I am planning to read that for 2024. So I'm super excited because I loved Legends and Lattes. This next book I read in audiobook format, and it became easily one of my most favorite books of this year, and that is Under the Whispering Door by TJ Klune. I have never read anything about death and grief and loss in this format before. And you know, death, loss, and grief tend to be very hard topics to write about, but the way that TJ Klune wrote about these topics in Under the Whispering Door, it was just so beautiful. So in this story, we're following Wallace, and Wallace is a very grumpy, I believe, lawyer. And one day, just out of nowhere, he ends up falling to his deathbed, and he's pretty young. I believe he's like in his 30s. So when Wallace pretty much dies, he ends up at Sharon's Crossing, which is pretty much a tea shop that is ran by Hugo, which is also where spirits come to cross and go to the afterlife. And so Wallace has about, I think, 12 days to try and make up his mind to either cross, and if he doesn't cross after those 12 days, then his spirit is stuck in the real world to just, I guess, not have any peace afterwards or go to the afterlife. And Hugo, the tea shop owner, he can see spirits, so his job is to pretty much help all the spirits that come to his tea shop to help them cross to the afterlife within those 12 days. This is a lovely book about loss and grief as well as romance. You absolutely fall in love with the characters. When I tell you guys that I sobbed to this book, oh my gosh, I absolutely sobbed. Also, if you do want to pick this book up, I highly recommend the audiobook. I had a blast with the audiobook. I think the narrator did a wonderful job. This book just easily became one of my favorite books of 2023. I absolutely loved it. Another audiobook that I read this year that I absolutely loved is A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking by T. Kingfisher. This is another cozy fantasy book that I just devoured. And in this book, we're following Mona, who is a 14-year-old wizard whose power is to make anything that she bakes come to life. So if she was to make like gingerbread, little men, and whatever she decides to bake, she can make those things actually come to life. So Mona works at her aunt's bakery, and then one day this wizard ends up dead at the bakery, and Mona ends up finding out that all wizards are being targeted, and in particular Mona is being targeted. So Mona has to put to use her very unusual gifts of making anything that she bakes come to life, make that useful to try and defeat this person that is targeting all wizards. This was again another cozy read that I just loved, and it was my first introduction to T. Kingfisher's writing. Also, the audiobook was amazing. If you want to read it in audiobook format, then I highly recommend the audiobook as well. This next book that I read, I haven't even gotten a chance to even mention it here on my channel, so this is the first time that I'm ever going to say anything about it, and that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I actually read this physically and also in audiobook format, which was a great experience. Highly recommend if you ever want to just make your reading maybe go a little bit faster, then I highly recommend to pop on the audiobook, and then also if you have the physical copy, just go ahead and follow along. For some reason, for me, it just makes me read faster. I don't know. Let me know if that happens to you guys. Have you guys ever tried that? Because for some reason, when I'm listening to the audiobook and also following along with my physical book, I get like reading superpowers and I just power through books. But this was a great read. This had me hooked from the very beginning. Once I read the synopsis, I was like, I'm gonna love this book. I know I am, and I have to read it. The book starts off, I believe, in the 1700s in France, and it follows our main character, Addie, who ends up making a deal with, I think, like a demon or something like that, to give her life forever. So she pretty much can't die. And I believe she does that because she's trying to escape an arranged marriage or something like that. So she ends up making that bargain. But in that bargain, she could live forever, but that means everyone she meets will never remember her, which is quite the plot if you ask me. Like, yes, you can live forever, but that means that everyone you meet will forget you right after. Yes, let me read that book. That is this book right here, you guys. So this follows Addie throughout many decades, and it's quite sad if you ask me, because she meets some wonderful people. She can't really fall in love, she can't make friends, because everyone she meets soon forgets her right after, until one day someone actually remembers her, and then that starts the whole story. The way also this book ended, it was like a big cliffhanger, and I don't even think there's another book. At least I don't think there is. I don't know, but I highly recommend, if you want something that gets you hooked right off the bat, highly recommend The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I absolutely just loved this book. My next book that I have on here that I read on audiobook format, and that I swore I had a physical one, but I know I read this on audiobook format. It is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. You guys, witchy books or books about witches, it's my jam. Like, give me all of that and I will die happily. Seriously. This follows an orphan witch named Mika Moon, who is part of this coven of witches. And Mika Moon one day decides to post videos online acting as a witch. So she does like little tutorials where she shows how to do like modern day witchcraft and stuff like that, but she's actually a witch. And she thinks that no one online is really gonna take her seriously until one day somebody does. And Mika receives this message saying if she can come and help train these orphan witches how to harness their powers. Of course, that is prohibited by her coven, but Mika doesn't care, and she goes and tries to help these little witches how to harness their powers, and thus begins a beautiful romance with the librarian of this nowhere house where she has to go. That's what the house is called, or where the orphan witches live, nowhere house. So Mika tries to help the young witches how to harness their powers. A beautiful romance sparks with the librarian of nowhere house. It is a beautiful, cozy fantasy book about love, about found family, about magic, and it just gave me all the whimsical coziness. I absolutely just adored this book. We are powering through this list. So you guys, this was the year for me that I got into Sarah J. Maas. I had never read any of her books before, and I've only read one this year, but it made it to my favorite books of 2023, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses, of course, by Sarah J. Maas. I don't know why I didn't continue reading the ACOTAR series after I read this book, and I think because I know in my head it's a big commitment, and so I've been putting it off. But you guys, I devoured A Court of Thorns and Roses. And this was the book that really got me more into like fantasy and high fantasy. I haven't read too much high fantasy, but it really sparked my interest after reading this book. I listened to the audiobook on this, and then short after I bought the whole series, which like I said, I've only read this one. But this follows Vera. Again, I'm sorry if I am pronouncing it wrong. You know, when you speak two languages, like I feel like my Spanish is trying to come out and also my English, and so when I pronounce stuff, it just sounds, sometimes it just sounds weird, so sorry. But yes, this follows Vera, and Vera is a human girl, and one day she ends up accidentally killing a wolf. And because of that, Vera ends up getting taken captive to the Fae world as punishment, because this wolf is actually a guy fairy. And thus Vera gets introduced to the Fae world, which she had only heard stories about the Fae pretty much ruling the entire world before, but now they're just subjected to their own little kingdoms. So like I mentioned, she gets taken captive, and in that captivity she meets Tamlin, a Fae lord. But in this world, a lot of the fairies are wearing masks, and that's because there's this disease that's spreaded, I believe, that is killing a lot of the fairies. And so then Vera ends up taking it upon herself to try and help Tamlin and his court to try and solve this mysterious case of like the disease that's happening and all that stuff. But there's a huge love romance going on in here, and honestly, it was just amazing. It was my first introduction to fantasy, and I could thank it all to this book. It was so amazing, and I'm planning to read the rest of the series, but it's a huge commitment, so we'll see in 2024. This next book that I read is actually a middle grade book, and that is Paula, Santiago, and the River of Tears by Taylor K. Mejia. This was so cute. It is one of my favorite folktale retellings that I've ever read. If you're familiar with the folktale of La Llorona, also known as the Weeping Woman in English, this is a retelling of that. This follows Paula, who is a space-obsessed 12-year-old. She loves anything that has to do with space and science, and because of that, she doesn't believe in superstitions, unlike her mom, who believes everything about superstitions. And her mom warns her about La Llorona, the weeping woman who is said to live near a creek around where they live, and she tells Paula not to go to that creek, until one day Paula of course doesn't listen, and her friends end up at the creek just to hang out. And the next day Paula ends up finding out that one of her friends never made it home, and that is because she was taken by the weeping woman. So of course Paula sets off on this quest to try and figure out how to get her friend back, and she gets sucked into this whole mystical universe of the weeping woman and all the kids that she has taken. Paula is now not only trying to get her friend back, but also trying to figure out how to free all the children, or have justice for all the children that the weeping woman has taken. It's a beautiful book about friendship, about loss. It's a great coming of age story. I had such a great time, and this is a whole series of Paula Santiago. So if you're looking for something fun to read and like a whole series, I highly recommend the Paula Santiago series. I had so much fun with this book. The next book that I read was also an audiobook format, and that is Vera Wong's Unsolicited Advice for Murder by Jessie Q. Sutanto. This was a hilarious murder mystery book. I had so much fun with this book, and I was literally laughing out loud with this book. This follows Vera Wong, who is a 60-year-old self-proclaimed tea expert who runs a tea shop in San Francisco. She is a widow, and she does have a son who doesn't live with her. He is somewhere else. I believe he's like a lawyer, and she's always constantly checking up on him to see if he's dating anyone and like pressuring him to date someone. Needless to say, Vera Wong has a lot of time on her hands, even though she does run the tea shop. And then mysteriously one day, Vera Wong wakes up to find a dead man inside of her tea shop. Of course, she calls the cops, but the cops kind of just brush it off as if it was just like an accident. They don't really take into consideration trying to do some good detective work. So of course, what does a 60-year-old widow who has a lot of time on her hands do? That's right, she gears up some detective work. So this is a story about Vera Wong trying to set off to try and find who the killer was, because she firmly believes that this was not an accident, this was intentional. I tell you guys, this book was so hilarious. I fell in love with the character of Vera Wong. Her personality is so quirky. It was hilarious. This is a good example of a character being written off just so good. You can really feel the personality coming off of the page. I had a great time with this book, so I highly recommend if you want a funny, cozy murder mystery. It was just so good. I really love this book. Another favorite read of 2023 was Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Maria Machado. This was one of the only few books that I read this year that were like contemporary feminist type of books. I used to read a lot of these books, but I put those categories on pause because I started just reading more like fantasy and cozy murder mysteries and that type of genre. But I just heard so many great things about this book and I wanted to give it a try, and of course it did not fail. This is a short story collection. I believe there are about 8 short stories in this book, and this book is labeled as a horror, magical realism, fiction, fantasy type of short stories. And of course the stories are all different, but the overall themes of the stories are about the struggles that women's bodies face and the realities of women's lives. It was a pretty hard read, but the writing was just so beautiful. I have mentioned this book before in one of my videos, and I remember saying that I haven't read something this impactful in the contemporary feminism genre in a long time. And in particular, Carmen Maria Machado's writing, it was just so beautifully written. I remember when I first read Sandra Cisneros' poetry collection, and I remember feeling just wow, like so inspired by her style of writing. And so when I read this book, it felt similar to that, just because their writings are just so beautiful. So if you're looking for a feminist short story collection, then I highly recommend this book, but please look up the trigger warnings because it did get pretty graphic and at times it was kind of hard to read, but it was so beautifully written. The next book that I have on here is of course another witchy book, and that is Witch of Wild Things by Raquel Vasquez Gilliand. I follow the author on Instagram, and I remember I came across one of her posts. She was pretty much talking about how she was able to get her book deal. She pretty much just mentioned how she told her publisher how this was practical magic, but just make it Latinx. And as soon as I read that post, I was like, practical magic but make it Latinx? I was like, I need to read this book because I love practical magic and I am a Latina myself, so I was like, I need to read this book. This follows the Flores women, who are a family of witches, and in particular we're following Sage Flores. Sage Flores is the oldest out of her 2 younger sisters, and they live with their great aunt. However, one day tragically her youngest sister loses her life in a very unfortunate accident, and even though Sage wasn't there, Sage gets pretty much blamed, or at least like her other sister blames her for what happened to the youngest sister. And soon after, Sage finds herself packing up her bags to leave the house that she grew up in because she's trying to cope with all this grief, but also she finds herself being followed or haunted by her dead sister's ghost. 8 years pass by, I believe, and she's still being haunted. She has suppressed her own powers, which, by the way, she has a beautiful gift. I believe she has like the power to have this special connection with plants, but she ends up losing her job, and so she has to come back to the house where she grew up. She still doesn't have a great relationship with her other sister, so this story is about her rekindling her relationship with her sister, as well as trying to finally figure out why she's being haunted by her other sister's ghost. And then there's a cute little old flame rekindling that happens in here that was just funny and cute. I had a great time with this book, and I could definitely see the practical magic influence on here. This book was just everything. I adore this book. To see Latinx folks represented in beautiful movies like practical magic, it was just the highlight of my year. And finally, you guys, the last book that I have on this list that was epic for me for 2023 was These Hollow Vows by Lexi Ryan. This is compared to A Court of Thorns and Roses meets, I think, A Cursed Prince, which I haven't read A Cursed Prince, so I'm not sure, but definitely A Court of Thorns and Roses. When I tell you guys that I sped through this book because it just was so good. I consumed this book so fast, I think like in 3 days, which is pretty fast for me. So this follows Bree, who is our main character, and Bree hates the Fae. But Bree also has a special little power that she hasn't really told anyone about, and that is that she can go invisible and she can like walk through walls, which makes her a great thief, and she uses that power that she has to steal, to try and keep afloat and help people in her community. And then one day, Bree's younger sister gets taken, or she is sold off to a Fae Lord. So of course Bree sets on this journey to try and get her sister back. And in order to do that, she must travel to the Fae kingdoms. And when she meets with this Fae Lord who has her sister captive, she's pretty much given an ultimatum. She's told that she must retrieve 3 items that this Fae Lord needs in order for her to set her sister free. And so Bree sets off to try and get these 3 items, and the only way that she can do that is if she goes and stays with this other Fae Lord who she knows, which is a whole other different story, because his court is the one that has these 3 items that that other Fae Lord needs. So she has to pretty much get him to like her, which is already a given because they already knew each other. And of course, while Bree is also staying at this other Fae court, she ends up meeting this other Fae Lord who is pretty much teaching her how to use her powers and how to harness her powers. But everyone pretty much has their own agenda. So Bree has to figure out who she can trust while also trying to set her sister free, while also falling for maybe 2 Fae Lords in between everything that's going on. This was such a good book, you guys. And I already have the second book to this, so I cannot wait to get to that one. But again, if you read A Court of Thorns and Roses and apparently A Cursed Prince, then you are bound to like these Hollow Vows. All right, you guys, these were my favorite books that I read in 2023. Again, these were all pretty much 4 or 5-star reads. These are stories that stayed in my heart and that I continue to think about them today. 2023 was a great reading year for me. It was a year that I really committed to reading again, and I'm just so happy that I made that decision, honestly. I read some amazing books this year and I cannot wait for 2024. I have like a never-ending list of books that I want to read in 2024, so I'm definitely gonna have to prioritize some books. I would love to know what some of your favorite 2023 books were that you read this year. Leave those down in the comments below. I would love to hear from you, or let me know if you read any of these books that I mentioned on here. Let me know if you like some of these. Again, friends, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching this video. I really appreciate you. Again, if you like this type of content from me, please hit the subscribe button. Please engage with this video. It really helps out my videos. I do have a goal to make it to 5,000 subscribers. I made it to my first goal this year, which was 1,000. So I have high hopes that I can make it for sure in 2024. Thank you again, friends. I am so grateful for your support. I appreciate you very much. And until then, friends, take care and bye for now.